It's the Pastor's Heart and Dominic Steele, and thanks for joining us today. Today, Getting Masculinity Right with Al Stewart. Al has a new book being launched this week. It's going to be much used and much talked about. It's called The Manual, Getting Masculinity Right. It's got a bold title and a bold thesis. Masculinity is fundamentally about how men use their power. When it's done in a healthy way, masculinity will serve and bless those it touches. Al Stewart is with me. He has all sorts of titles. He is the National Director or Chief Boogie Woogie of the Fellowship of Independent Evangelical Churches Australia.
You got it right, Dominic. Well done.
Al and I have been friends for 30 years. I first met Al when he was a junior pastor in Mount Druitt in Western Sydney, just a couple of years out of theological college, and I was a newsreader on a radio station nearby. I was his first ministry trainee, and he preached at our wedding. And I don't know why it's taken us 4 years to get you on the Pastor's Heart, Al, but thank you for coming in today.
It's nice to be here, mate. Nice to be here.
You have had a long-term Pastor's Heart for men.
Oh, yes. I've 35 years of ministry. I've spoken at hundreds and hundreds of events for men, had thousands of conversations. Yeah, that's what grabs my heart.
Mm-hmm. John Anderson said in the forward,
yeah.
John Anderson said in the forward, we must break the cycle of lostness and brokenness in our boys and men. There's a cycle of lostness and brokenness.
Yeah, I mean, I talk to lots at the church I'm at places. I talk to lots of young men who are, I suppose, the title's, father hungry, or there's a father hunger there. They're looking for that next generation who will advise them, model them. What does it look like to be a man? And there's a lot of confusion with young guys there. So what's it about? Well, it's I'm trying to give guidance for young ones and encouragement for older ones.
There's confusion. I mean, let's just talk firstly confusion in role models on popular television.
Oh, yeah, sure. In the book I've mentioned, you can see the change over the last 40, 50 years from Happy Days and the Brady Bunch in the...
And Richie Cunningham's dad. He was an attractive man.
He was part of the solution. He was wise and calm, the non-anxious presence. But you just tick along not too far, and then you've got, everyone loves Raymond, and Raymond's a complete useless idiot. And then, Homer Simpson arrives in the late 80s. Now, Homer's funny, but he's hardly a role model. And so, then there's Peppa Pig, and then there's,
Peppa Pig?
Peppa Pig is a pig in a children's cartoon show, and of course her dad is, a fat, useless pig. And it's just a constant drip, drip, drip to show men as either, basically men as incompetent fools, whether that be in television shows, sitcoms, or advertising. And it just keeps going. Well, then there was that terrible system of ads that Gillette had about toxic masculinity, and that was just they're just cashing in on wokeness.
And so there's a generation of men who are confused on what it is to be a man.
I think so. Not every young man, but many young men, and certainly in the Western world, westernised societies, I think there is confusion, and that's a mixture of aggressive attacks from people with an agenda, and also a passive response from men. It's there's both sides of it. There's men not knowing how to respond, but also there's aggressive, the whole toxic masculinity thing is an attack on the idea of masculinity.
So, what's your thesis? What is a man? What is the ideal man?
Well, a man is an adult human male. All right. So there's only two sexes, male and female, and it's that's determined by your reproductive system and the reproductive cells that your body produces. Yes. But gender, I think, is much more about how is it that men and women portray that within a society. Right? And so it can be a little bit circular. What is masculinity? Well, masculinity is how men behave. How are men meant to behave? Well, they're meant to behave in masculine ways. So the way in which masculinity's lived out will vary from culture to culture, all right? But there's certain things, if you go to the Bible has certain things to say about the way that men should behave and what healthy masculinity will look like.
Mm-hmm.
All right? I mean, keep going.
Healthy masculinity?
Healthy masculinity, I think, in our world, and the Bible reinforces this, men have power. We just do. For example, in your average marriage, a man is bigger and stronger than his wife. A man is bigger and stronger than his children. Very often a man has financial power. A man has a freedom, etc., because of the simple biology of women and childbearing. Men have power. Now, what does healthy masculinity look like? Healthy masculinity is a willingness to step up and use that power to care for and nurture the people around you. So it's not that men shouldn't have power, we do, but to use it properly is to love and care for and look after the people that you should be prepared to take responsibility for.
Now, are you just being countercultural, or are you being biblical?
I think I'm being biblical.
Okay.
Okay. So
you've got a chapter arguing that. So
I have.
Give it to
I have.
us, yeah.
Well, in each, the way the Bible understands people, I see if you agree, but the Bible talks about us, yes, as individuals, yes, but as individuals in relationship. Mm-hmm. So if you want to know what it looks like to be a man, it'll be, how does a man relate to other people? Mm-hmm. How do you relate as, well, as a creature before your creator, but also how do you relate as a son, as a husband, as a father, as a friend, as a workmate? And the Bible, in each of those relationships, particularly in terms of husband and father, the Bible assumes you have power. Mm-hmm. A husband has power not just because he's bigger and stronger, although 1 Peter 3 assumes that. A wife is a weaker vessel, while a husband's bigger and stronger. But a husband has that power because God gives him the role of being head of a family, mm-hmm. and the wife is told to be submissive. Now, I know that's terrible to say that today, but what does that mean? Well, when you drill down on what's said in Ephesians 5, a husband is to take the initiative in laying down his life to use the power that he has to care for and love and look after her. And what does submission look like? Well, it's her willing response to that sacrificial love. But there is power there. Just like the Lord Jesus, who said to be, he's the head of the church. Well, he has power. How did he use that? To love and bless and care for his church. So it's, yep, there's power there. Or you go to the beginning of the book of Ephesians, the beginning of Ephesians 6, and you've got fathers being told to care, to train and instruct their children in the Lord and not to exasperate their children. Meaning what? Fathers have all sorts of power over their children. Misuse that, you'll exasperate or frustrate them. But if you use it the right way, you'll train and teach and bring them up in the knowledge of the Lord.
So it seems as though people noticing that men have power have said, well, we've got to stop men having power, or we've got to restrict their power. But what you're saying is actually you've got to listen to God on how you should use the power.
Yes, yes. I think the move, you see it in different ways. If you think the world is simply a power struggle and all power is therefore bad, then how do you respond to masculinity? Well, either you'll label it as toxic, which happens, or you'll confuse the boundaries. You'll want to blur or feminise men. You'll want to turn men into behaving in feminine ways, and that reduces that masculinity. Now, you see both of those at work in our society. Confusion of men and women and feminising men, yeah, or just anything to do with men being labelled as toxic. And I think part of that, you keep getting that drip, drip, drip all the time. It's part of the reason why particularly young men are confused about it. And I'm saying, no, masculinity's good, and men have power, and you need to be aware of that and use that in the right way to bless the people around you. Now, how does that resonate? Well, that's in the Bible, but what's interesting, I've watched Jordan Peterson since when was it? Oh, the last few years. I think 2016 was his first. He kind of became, it became so popular. His message is, life is hard, get your act together and make a difference for the people around you. And it's young men that resonates with. He speaks generally, but it's young men who jump up and say, hey, that resonates. Well, that's what you're made for. As a man, you're made to care for and look after people around you and take responsibility. Where does that fail? Well, it fails when you've got guys in their 30s sitting in their jammies in their mother's bed, you know, the bedroom in their mother's home playing computer games.
You had a lovely illustration about, you were arguing that the truly masculine man will make the people around them feel safe. And your example was a story about our mutual friend Tony Willis.
Yes.
Tell us that story.
I'll tell you the story. Tony, had the privilege of working with Tony for 20 years or so, and he's a very gifted administrator, organiser. He worked in our church office. Actually, both of us have worked for that church at different times. And Tony decided that after 10 years he was going to leave and go and do something else in Christian ministry. And the two girls who worked in the office were actually quite nervous about him leaving, quite kind of afraid of what would happen. And at Tony's farewell, our senior minister stood up and said, it's actually a good thing because it points to what Tony is like. Tony makes people feel safe. And it's that feeling of if Tony's here, everything's okay. It's under control. Why? Because he's a very gifted man. He takes responsibility for things. He's reliable. He's not selfish. It's okay because Tony's here. He makes people feel safe.
I mean, perhaps a different way of saying it, and you say it in the book, is he lays down his life for others. You know, he acts sacrificially.
Yeah. And I think there's someone in the Bible who calls his men to do that.
Keep going.
Well, isn't it interesting? That's exactly what Jesus says it means to be his man. What? To say no to self, to lay down your life and to follow him. Take up your cross. So the way to live is without selfishness. Now, none of us achieves that exactly.
Actually, men have a particular problem with selfishness in.
Yeah, I think...
That's our particular sin.
I think it is, yes. And why is it? I think we can get away with it. We do. The default position for a man in marriage is selfishness. Women, I'll just say it, I think women are much more likely to sacrificially invest in the marriage, to carry more than their own share, to invest in children more, etc. We
coast.
We coast. We can easily be selfish. Why? Because we can get away with it. And that, I think, the whole thing about healthy masculinity is to stop being selfish, take the responsibility that we know we should, and care for other people.
So halfway through, there's a change in tone. Well, you're kind of building up to it for the first part, but then you change tone. You say, man up in all these different relationships. But before you get to that, as you're talking about manning up, you talk about delayed gratification. How does that play out?
Yeah, well, that's the idea of how do you look after future you?
The one in heaven?
Well, yeah, I guess that's the end point. But let's talk about Dominic in 5 years' time. The way that you look after future you means that present you has to make decisions and do without some gratification now.
Sacrificial decisions.
Yeah, exactly, now. Like, I'm not going to drink too much, I'm not going to live on junk food, etc. Or that's just a simple one. But how do you make decisions now that will look after future you? And so delayed gratification is about being prepared to do without certain things now because you know that the future will be better because of that. And so that's part of being a grown-up. That's why you study and get qualifications. That's why it's the disciplines in life as well. You know, if you're a Christian person, to have the discipline of reading your Bible regularly, the discipline of prayer, the discipline of turning up at church even when you're tired, those kind of things. in some ways it's all delayed gratification, because you know they're the routines that will mean in the future you'll be okay. In fact, how you are now, where you are in life now, is a function of how past you looked after future you. Okay? So that's the call to men, and that is to understand that and to get life in order now. And there'll always be an element of delayed gratification as you look to the future. If you want to achieve anything, it's got to be.
In your Future You chapter, you're quite vulnerable on the issue of temptation, alcohol, pornography. Do you want to just take us through some of that?
Sure. Okay. Well, if this is
it's just us.
Just between us and, yeah. I thought I'd talk about two significant issues that men, well, at least the men I've dealt with within Australia, but I'm sure it's wider than that, two significant issues that men struggle with, and that is alcohol and pornography. I notice in myself and in my wider family there have been problems with alcohol. Or I notice in myself the temptation that way. And so for me, I've realised the way to get that under control is actually just stop. If I have a few drinks, I'm looking for more. Another way of saying is I have trouble putting the brakes on, so I decided I'd just take the wheels off the car. I haven't had a drink since the 16th of July 2006.
That's what you say on page 92.
There you go, I remember. That's true.
It was a big day, I take it, yeah.
Oh, I mean, I know I had some red wine the night before, and I'd probably had a couple too many, and I woke up with a headache, and I sat down and had a real hard think about that and decided, no, I need to get this under control, and I need to bring my best self to every event. Now, it mightn't be great, but it'll be the best I've got. And so that's what I've decided to do. I still miss it occasionally, but it's much better to have that under control, and I don't do moderation very well, so I've just stopped. And so I talk to other men. If you're having a problem with alcohol, you need to confront that. There's nothing wrong with having a drink at all. My lovely wife, Kathy, can open a bottle of wine and have one glass
and put it back in the fridge.
And then have another glass the next night. And if I open a bottle of wine, I want to finish it. So that's just the difference. Kathy's complete self-control. Me, no. So that's it. The pornography thing is a plague now. Certainly the internet has just made it completely accessible, anonymous, and apparently affordable, free. I say apparently because there's always a price. And so many, many men struggle with this because it's actually the way we're wired up to be visual, to be visually aroused, to appreciate, just to be sexually aware, and pornography taps into that exactly. Now, what I'll say in this book is it's important for men to understand why this stuff is poison and how it works. What it does is, I used to think of it as a sugar hit, but it's not. It's a dopamine hit. Dopamine's the hormone that touches the pleasure centres in your brain, and when men look at pornography, it lights that up, and the dopamine in your brain skyrockets. It goes incredibly high as taking drugs, and so it's a dopamine hit. And whoa, right, okay. The trouble is that over time, that elevated level of dopamine means that your brain compensates, and the number of dopamine receptors decreases. If you like, your brain automatically adjusts and flattens that out. Over time, it will mean that you don't get the hit, or you're looking for more and more extreme stuff to get a dopamine rush. Eventually, life greys out because you don't get dopamine out of from anything. And so you see addiction, you see men dragged into more and more extreme forms of this. It really is evil. It'll change the way you think about women. What's his name? Lombardo, who wrote Man Disconnected, talks about the fact that over time it means that it makes men incapable of sex with a real woman. It'll lead to all sorts of sexual dysfunction. It's poison, and so we've got to work out ways of actually. I guess there's two things. One is the spiritual understanding. The other is the pragmatics. At a pragmatic level, you need to actually work out ways of actually stopping us looking at this stuff through the internet. Net nannies and I'm on Covenant Eyes on every screen that I've got, which means I can't look at the stuff, or if I do, it tells Kathy or that other friend of mine, Tony Willis, where I've been. So I'm thinking, oh, I wouldn't do that.
I don't want to have that conversation.
I don't want to have that conversation with either of them. They're scary people. But the other is to understand, in 1 Peter, I think the most relevant verse, in 1 Peter chapter 2, Peter says, stay away from the sinful desires which wage war on your soul. And this, for men, particularly for men who follow Jesus, pornography will rot your soul. It'll destroy your walk with God. It eats you inside. And that's the great reason to fight this. And I think men, the reason I've fessed up in this and said this is still a temptation, is that it's very hard to fight it alone. And so I encourage men to talk. If you're a follower of Jesus, to talk to a mature Christian man who you can talk to about this and get some help. Talk to your pastor. There's lots of resources around to help you beat this, to get it under control. I don't think the temptation will ever go away. You've got to work out ways of actually fighting this, of keeping your foot on its throat day by day.
I'm just going to bowl up to you kind of one-day cricket points from the back half of the book, and you can kind of hit each one for 6. How do I man up as a son?
It is interesting that Jesus' great criticism of the religious leaders of his day in Mark chapter 7, of the men, is that they did not care for their parents.
Tried to get out of it, Corban.
Yes, they used the bush lawyer tactic of moving their resources kind of offshore, so they could say, "Oh, Mum, Dad, I got nothing." You know, to man up as a son is to actually honour your father and mother, to be thankful for them, and to care for them. Now, I've got all sorts of thoughts about how you do that, and sometimes there's boundaries that need to be put in place. Your parents will not always be reasonable in what they want, etc. And you need wisdom. But there's a great call to care for our parents and to honour them. And it's interesting that the 5th commandment doesn't say honour your father and mother if they deserve it. It says honour your father and mother. So I can say more if you wish.
No, okay, this is one-day cricket, so it's fast.
Okay.
Man up as a friend.
Yeah, as a friend. Study after study shows that men, particularly by the time they get to middle age, have very few friends.
Yeah.
Now, loneliness is an issue. Quick Google search will show you many public health officials think loneliness is the next public health crisis. But particularly, it's an issue for men.
Actually, you're writing this book for the general male audience. We got a lot of pastors watching. Being a pastor, we have got lots of fellow travellers, lots of people we're caring for.
Yes.
But do we as senior ministers have genuine friends? This isn't part of the book. I'm just kind of...
No, I think that's a good question. Yes. Now, by the way, I've tried to write this so that you could hand it to someone who's not a Christian. It doesn't assume that the reader will automatically be a Christian. It's more saying, look, if you're a Christian, if you're not, you might want to have a think about this. Okay. Yeah, pastors. It's possible to know a whole lot of people but not really have friends. I've talked in here about the cost of friendship. Now, this
You had a very strong, an illustration that really struck me about a state of origin night.
Oh, yes. Oh, with the friend next door, yes.
Tell us that.
It's slightly embarrassing. Okay. State of Origin is the #1 rugby league or football game of the year. Yeah. It's about to start. It's a few years ago, and I
read this chapter the morning after State of Origin last week.
Ah, right. Yeah, right. And I had 2 or 3 guys I knew around. We were going to watch it on the television, and I heard a noise outside. I went outside, and my neighbour, who I knew quite well, was standing there looking forlorn, and it turned out he just had a fight with his wife, and it was a pretty serious fight, and she'd stormed off, and he was standing there wondering what has just happened to my life. And to my shame, I gave him a couple of cliches and walked back in because the football was starting. And that's a few years ago, and I still deeply regret that. Mm. It was friendship. It's actually making time for people. And that comes in 2 forms. One is you need to plan time for friends, but the other is sometimes there's a crisis and the football can wait. Yeah. The irony is I can't remember who won that football game. Who cares? But it's still...
Probably Queensland.
Probably. It's still, I could put a stone in my shoe every time I think about that I didn't make the time for that man. And it's a little thing for me now. When that happens, I will make the time no matter what it's interrupting. That's what I hope.
Manning up as a workmate. You spent a lot of time alongside city workers.
Yeah, one way or another, I've worked with a group called City Bible Forum, often as a volunteer, for around 20 years. Yeah, and quite a lot of time with men who businessmen in the CBD. Yep.
And yet it was an illustration from Jack Gibson in this book about the phone not ringing that really stopped you in your tracks. Yeah,
that's a good story too. In the early 90s, I was the chaplain to the Sydney City Roosters. That's a rugby league team, professional football here in Sydney. They're the best team, of course. Still are. And I turned up as chaplain, which is kind of a slightly awkward thing to do, and part of the reason I was invited as chaplain is that Jack Gibson, the team manager, was keen for that. Now, I'd grown up with him being my boyhood hero.
Yeah,
I'd watched him on, I watched him on television, and then I finally got to meet him. He was very kind to me. He was a big man in every way. And then one night I was at training at Henson Park in Sydney, and it was dark and cold, and he was on one side of the picket fence around the oval. I was on the other side, and he was speaking to me. And he said, when I was State of Origin coach in the late 80s, the phone rang 80 times a day. It's every 10 minutes, I worked it out, with journalists asking what I was doing and asking about the football and the kind of. So he was the epicentre of this huge event. And I think by then, as he spoke to me, he was in the twilight of his career. And he said 80 times a day. And he said, and now the phone doesn't ring so much anymore. And he looked at me and said, so you better get ready for the time when the phone doesn't ring so much. And that really struck me about the fact that men so easily pour our lives into work and we feel significant and people are after us all the time and the phone rings and there's a million emails and meetings, but the time will come when all that stops. And what do you have left?
Draw the application from that for senior pastors.
For senior pastors?
Because, I mean, we're at the epicentre of church every Sunday. And yet there's going to come a time when we're not going to be at the epicentre of church every Sunday.
That's
and I'm 57 and you're a couple of years older than me.
Just a couple. Yeah, that's right. That's right. So when you're not the epicentre now, what will be left? Well, I'll tell you what will be left. It's the relationships that you've invested in.
Now.
What I mean is now. So you better know who's going to be left when everything quietens down. And so, is your marriage strong? If you have kids, are you investing in them? Do you have friends? So you can work, but there will come a time when the phone stops ringing. Now, my friend Bay Warburton, who was the Chief of Staff for Mike Baird, the Premier of New South Wales, Bay spoke at a thing I heard. He talked about relevance deficit syndrome, meaning relevance deficit syndrome. We'll all suffer from it, meaning when you're out of the centre and people stop wanting to get hold of you, etc., well, what will be left when everything's quiet? Good thing to think about. And how do you do that? Well, you look after future you. Right? Can you think ahead to what will be left when I'm not the epicentre of church, or I'm not the most important at work, or how do I do that? How do I invest in relationships that will last beyond that, beyond just my role in my job?
There's a couple more chapters. There's manning up as a single man, there's manning up as a husband, and manning up as a father. But I think we might get you back for them. I think I want to drill a little deeper into what you say in those chapters. So,
Sure, happy to come back. Now, I'm still working it out as a husband and father. That's only, I've only been a husband 41 years, so I'm still learning. And a dad for 38 years, I think. So obviously just beginning.
Yeah.
But, yep.
I mean, that is the struggle. I mean, I remember being frustrated with my pastor, that I thought, I became a Christian at 20, and you've taught me nothing really. You've taught me all this stuff about dating, but nothing really about how to be a dad, you know. And here am I, I've now been sitting here for 20 years, and I'm thinking, have I taught my congregation well enough on how to be a dad? I've tried, but like you, I felt I'm still making it up as I've gone along. Yeah.
I think that's true, especially the parenting thing. Anyone who thinks they're an expert on parenting probably hasn't had children.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We all know we're making it up as we go, but I think I've learned a few things.
Yeah. Well, I'll look forward to getting you back in probably a month or so, and we'll
Okay.
talk further on marriage and fatherhood. This is the book, Al Stewart, The Manual, Getting Masculinity Right. We put a link in the show notes to the Matthias Media page so you can get a copy of it. I think it's going to be a significant book that's going to have a big impact, and I hope that you'll read it or buy it for a friend. This has been The Pastor's Heart. We'll look forward to your company next Tuesday afternoon. Thanks.